Now it's time to be looking at the policy context that we've been moving ourselves into. This has been a really interesting year since the last time we've met, because we've seen a lot of movements at European level. When we talk about the decarbonization plans, there's been the European Green Deal going on. The European Green Deal in total is more than 50 pieces of legislation, but energy and climate specifically, we're talking about some 10 to 14 pieces of legislation that have been agreed. We have a new emissions trading system. We have new renewable energy targets. We have a new carbon border adjustment mechanism coming up that is going to be taxing power imports. So really exciting developments, and now we're also going to be discussing, or we are already discussing, changes to our power market and how it could impact us energy buyers in practice. For that, who better to guide us in this context than the International Energy and Sustainability Consultant at E&C Consultants, its very own Bart Verest.
Good morning and welcome all on next session on government intervention in energy markets. As you all know, it has been quite some turbulent period in the past 2 years, and we focused on that from a commodity perspective, energy markets and their movements. We saw how that impacted the PPA market in itself. And that was no different for anything that has to do with government regulation, government intervention, both on a national and international and European level. To give you a bit of an idea, some of you might know we send out these grid fees and taxes flashes from time to time. And in the last year, in 2022, we sent out close to 150 of those kind of market messages. And I can tell you, we always make a bit of a trade-off. Do we want to send out or do we just leave it as it is? So we made there the decision, close to 150 of them were relevant, and that is more than what we did in the 3 years before. So that gives you a bit of an idea of how much regulatory change was going on in the past period. And fortunately or unfortunately, I leave that up to you, we'll see probably something similar in the upcoming period as well. So I'll start with a bit of a high-level overview of the European energy policy throughout time. Then I'll focus a bit more on 4 key packages that are really relevant for you as an energy buyer to understand. Then we'll go a bit more in detail on the ongoing and upcoming measures. And at the end, I'll end the part with something on liberalization and some of the price gaps we have seen in the past 24 months. To put it in a historical perspective, I start even before the founding of the European Union, because for me, the energy market, as we know, it has been an energy union, and that's basically started already in 1951 with the European Community of Steel and Coal, where a few core European countries came together and said, okay, energy is so important for us that we need to make sure that we work together on that across borders, and that's exactly what happened prior even to the founding of the European Union. Then it took a relatively long period where we had monopolies in place, where we had tarification in place, and it's a bit a similar process as what Jenny described, what is happening in China at this moment in time. We saw that happening as of '96 in Europe as well. We had a few what we call energy packages where where the European institutions started to liberalize the energy markets, to go into the direction of unbundling, to develop transmission grid operators, distribution grid operators. And the main purpose there was to have an open and fair competitive market. And that's what they did between '96 and 2009, step by step. And then afterwards, some 10 years later, they realized, okay, we have this open and competitive market, is well functioning, but at that moment in time, it was not adapted to the reality that we saw appearing, namely the energy transition. So a new package of legislation had to come up to make sure that the markets were adapting for that new reality. And we were a bit lagging behind there on what already happened. And that started in 2019 with the 4th energy package. Then a very, very important one launched in 2021 with the 5th energy package, the so-called Fit for 55, and then last year, the Repower EU program. What this basically brought us is what you see at the bottom from left to right. You used to have a situation where you had an open market, you could have your electricity or gas contract, and we moved into a situation where you had electricity contract, on-site PPA, off-site PPA, balancing markets, capacity markets. So basically the whole same process as what Jenny described that is taking place in China at this moment in time. Keep in mind, most of that energy transition between 2019 and 2021 was focused on electricity because that's where most of the action was taking place at that moment in time. As you know from last year, gas started to play a quite particular role afterwards, so we'll focus a bit more on that later on. In that period of adaptation to the energy transition, the first one was the clean energy package. It's basically an adaptation of the regulatory framework, of the market design adapting to renewable sources, decentralized sources of energy. So that's a very important one. Then after that, we had the Green Deal with the purpose of supplying clean, affordable, and secure energy. And the Green Deal is, I would say, the biggest monster in the European institution. It is so broad. So I bring it up here for energy in general, but it is much broader than that. It has a social component into it. It has a materials component into it, agriculture, transportation. So energy is only a small part of that Green Deal. And there they made the heart of what we see as the European legislation, namely the European climate law. That's what they did in that Green Deal. The Green Deal, the purpose is to come to a climate-neutral continent, European continent, by 2050. That is the main goal, and that's what they started doing there. However, quite shortly after, they realized, well, it's very nice to have that goal, that long-term goal, but how do we have to put that into reality? How do we put that into action? And that's where they came up with the Fit for 55, namely, we want to have a 55% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030 versus 1990 levels, as a step in between now and 2050. And we have to make sure that those goals are tangible, that they're realistic, rather than just the Green Deal, this very high-level long-term goal. And then the last of those four was the Repower EU program, where we, after the Ukrainian war started again in 21, where we wanted to phase out the dependency on Russian fossil fuels in general, and that basically adaptation to the new reality we face since February 22. So Fit for 55, originally 55% greenhouse gas reduction versus by 2030 versus 1990. Later on, those goals were made a bit sharper. So this is an interesting one because that's a difference with the Chinese approach. In the Chinese approach, they make a greenhouse gas reduction based on GDP. Here we do it in absolute numbers. So this is the goal that we're going for, and then we have to translate that into legislation directives to make sure that we reach it. And the long-term goal is then that carbon neutrality by 2050. Fit for 55 is again quite a broad package, and you'll recognize parts of it. You will see here the EU ETS, the European Emission Trading Scheme, that is part of it. The CBAM, as you can see, European institutions, they love abbreviations. So CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Electricity markets reform being part of that. Hydrogen plays a role in there. Renewable plays a role in there as well. I'll go a bit more in detail later on, but the Fit for 55, if I want you to remember one thing of this presentation, is the Fit for 55 and all the details that it entails. The Fit for 55, part of it has been agreed on already and is concluded, was voted on, it's sealed, but not all of it. So for example, the part that is sealed is on the EU ETS. We have the existing emission trading scheme. We expanded the scope of that, so prior to that it was electricity generation, industrial consumers that are part of it, but we extended that, for example, into the maritime sector. Shipments will become, throughout time, will become part of it as well. And at the same time, there was the agreement to say we will reduce the amount of free allocation that is given to you as an industrial consumer. The idea of that would step by step, completely phasing out free allocation to make sure that all the emissions that you have, that you'll have to procure them in the form of emission trading certificates. At first, they wanted to expand the scope even broader, just not maritime sector, but also building and road transportation. And then at least somebody said, guys, this is going to be too complicated. Let's make a separate ETS for that. So that's where they came up with the ETS2 that will be focused on transportation and building. So that means that not only industrial consumers, but also you as a person in your daily life will be impacted by the ETS2 in the forms of your transportation, heating of your buildings, and so on. So we cover everything within Europe under ETS. What do we do with all the emissions and the goods that come from outside Europe? That's where they came up with another abbreviation, the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is basically an ETS for everything that happens outside Europe. Of course, we don't have any jurisdiction on that, so they found a solution and they say, if you import goods into Europe, you'll have to pay a tax on that that is equal to the ETS pricing system. This will be again linked with free allocation that phases out throughout time. The CBAM, it is something that almost starts like an experiment. So what we will start with is certain sectors like iron and steel, aluminium, cement, electricity production, some smaller components. And it will start to phase in as of October 2023 already. So that is really soon. Then there will be a test phase until the end of 25. And as of 26, the real game will start. And that is funny because this is one of the parts of the legislation that is not final yet. It's voted, but not all the details are set and sealed yet. So October 23, that is tomorrow. But as you might know, some of the devil is sometimes in the details, and that's what will be here with CBAM as well, and not all of those details are published yet. The idea is that if you don't pay any emission trading scheme taxation in your own country, you'll have to pay it under the form of CBAM. So it creates an incentive for countries outside the EU ETS to come up with some sort of carbon taxation system themselves, a cap and trade system or a tax or anything in that sense. And that's what we see if we zoom out and we have a look at the global scale. Then we see in blue some of the emission trading scheme and carbon prices that are in force at this moment in time. Those are 28. There are in dark green some 8 more that are under development, and in light green some 12 more that are under consideration at this moment in time. So globally, you could say we have 68 emission trading schemes, CO2 markets, that cover around 70% of the greenhouse gases globally. So that's quite extensive. And this creates an incentive for non-European countries to create some kind of emission trading scheme themselves. But I don't think that will go quite easy. We saw already India and China pushing back on this in the context of the World Trade Organization, where they say this is unfair competition, we don't want this to take place. So in coming periods, expect quite some pushback, quite some headline titles on this CBAM to be introduced, and the position that China, India, US, and other important importers into Europe will take. Then last year, after the invasion, we had the announcement of the so-called Repower EU program. And the idea of that was getting rid of this Russian fossil fuel imports. And we did that in a few different ways. I highlighted a few of them here. So 8th of March was the first official announcement of the Repower EU program. And then by summer, we saw that we wanted to avoid that mistake of not filling storages enough. Jens pointed towards that. Throughout time, prices went through the roof in 22. August 22 was some of the peak period. We didn't want to end up in the same situation. So to make sure that gas storages were filled again, they came up with a minimum obligation of filling gas storages. This is still in place, and for example, by November 23, we have to make sure that European gas storages are filled up to 90%, preparing ahead of the coming winter. Then later on in the summer period, they came up with some sort of coordinated reduction measures. So they said, okay, we did something on the gas storage level. We want to intervene in demand as well. So they implemented a European-wide voluntary demand reduction scheme where they said to each of the member states, we want you to reduce consumption for natural gas, for electricity, peak electricity as well, and we want you to report on that. Again, still in place until this moment in time, but all of that being voluntarily. Then ahead of the summer, we had this high peak in August, and panic was going around on government level and industry level, and they said, well, okay, we did something on storage, we did something on demand. Can't we do anything on prices? That's always a difficult discussion in Brussels, how to intervene on prices. So they say, okay, we'll come up with a solution, we will do some emergency measures. You might recognize from there the so-called electricity price cap on inframarginal electricity production, and you also might recognize this price cap on natural gas. It seems to be far-fetched, but Acer, until this day, is every day publishing the gas price and an LNG basket to see if gas prices are not too high and if they should not intervene. I think the first days after publication, everybody was interested in it. Then prices came down and nobody is looking at that price cap anymore, but there is still that price cap and the option for intervention in place for natural gas. And then the last part of that is a bit more than a month ago, where they said, well, last year we were out competing each other for natural gas for the winter. We want to avoid that. Let's work together instead, and let's aggregate the volumes we need to fill the storages and aggregate the demands of some of our big industrial consumers that are here in the room today, and go to the open market together and see what best offers we can get from the market by working together rather than competing with each other. Tender for that was launched. First results came in the past weeks, and this is a test case to see, is this an alternative to the energy market to look for natural gas supplies. So a lot has happened in the last 12 to 24 months, and a lot of it is still ongoing at this moment in time, and there is quite some more to expect. So what you can see here is what I call the European legislative train. It starts in one station, very often the European Commission or the European Council, and hopefully it ends at certain right station after, on average, 2 years, let's say. And what we see here is what stations do we have in between. And we did that here for quite some regulations. If we go back to the map from the beginning, then we saw, okay, we had this period of liberalization, we had this period of energy transition, but a lot of that was focused on electricity. What happened to natural gas? For natural gas, actually not much changed since that third energy package in 2009. The gas markets regulation didn't change. And suddenly they realized we're left behind. We didn't do enough to adapt the gas market to the new reality at this moment in time. Because it looks, that map at the bottom, that visual looks very similar to the first one, but what I drew here is more gas contracts. The time that you will have only one gas contract is probably over. In the past, you signed your natural gas contract and that was it. In the coming period, you might sign your renewable gases contract, your low carbon gases contract, your hydrogen contract, and maybe some natural gas contract as a residual. So probably like the same what you had with your PPA exercise for electricity, all of that fun will start again with natural gas blending into your portfolio of supply. So there is a lot of gas regulation that is going on, what they call the gas package, some regulations, some directives on that, and a lot of focus there will go on renewable gases, low carbon gases, and hydrogen. So that is basically the same adaptation to the energy transition of the gas market that is happening now than what happened some years ago for electricity. At the same time, we have the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive going on. They're intervening in the working of guarantees of origin. They're intervening in the goals and number of shares of renewable energy and so on. And there are a few interesting things we can learn from there. If we have a look at the hydrogen market, we see that they started to implement for green hydrogen the idea of proximity. The way you're buying your guarantees of origin at this moment in time is you buy a guarantee of origin and you cover your electricity consumption for that year. What they said for hydrogen is we don't want to happen that again. We want to have a proximity in time. You're buying a green certificate for your hydrogen for the same week, day, hour, month. So much more proximity on time, but also on region. Not like a guarantee of origin for your consumption in Spain generated by some installation in Iceland. We want that hydrogen to be generated close to where it is consumed. So this could lead to some changes in the GEO market for electricity as well. Then another important one is the revision of the Energy Taxation Directive. Until now, a lot of taxation happened on the commodity itself, so gas was taxed different than electricity, and there were a lot of reductions, exemptions, and so on possible, and also differences between groups of consumers were possible. That is something that they will change and that they will try to get rid of. They want to get rid of certain of the reductions and exemptions. They want to get rid of certain differences between energy carriers, and they will put everything at the energy that certain carrier has and put a price on that. The underlying idea is to shift taxation from electricity to natural gas to give support to the whole exercise of electrification of industrial processes. So this will be really a key directive that is coming up because it could completely shift your business case of gas-fired heating versus electricity and so on. And then the last one is the reform of the EU electricity market. After the crisis, they sat together and they took those emergency measures, but they realized quite quickly, well, this is something short term. We need to work on something longer term to reform the energy market again. I mean, it happened not too long ago. We saw that in the various packages before. They are doing that again at this moment in time. Today we discussed already about PPA markets. At this moment in time, the PPA market and your residual volume, those are two completely separate markets. Under the reform of the electricity market design, we see some proposals going into the direction of PPA markets blending into the reality of normal electricity market as we knew it before. So that could be interesting because that could mean a boost for liquidity, transparency, and so on of the PPA market, some of the lessons learned we saw in that PPA session. Same is happening, by the way, with hydrogen and natural gas. So there they are preparing to blend in some of the hydrogen into the natural gas market as well. Bit of an overview of what to expect. So you can see May, June, we already have all of the regulatory topics that I pointed out on the agenda for the coming period. So the next step here will be the energy transition with more focus on what was left out before, namely natural gas, PPAs, guarantees of origin, and energy taxation. And that brings me to the last part, because when we go back to that 1996 and all the excitement of the liberalization of the energy market, everybody was looking into that same direction. Let's liberalize the energy market. They worked on that for more than 10 years. 10 years after that, they started working on that again. Now, what we see at this moment in time after the energy crisis is a bit the same as what we saw after COVID. Every country doing whatever he or she thought was the best for them. So we saw a very scattered field of measures being taken, and instead of everybody walking into the same direction, everybody started to walk in a different direction and running around, leading to this situation throughout Europe and completely abolishing the level playing field we had until that moment in time. And that's also why there was pressure on the European institutions to come with those emergency measures to make sure that everybody was walking into the same direction again. We saw countries taking more of a protective approach again and implementing price caps. On the top, we see two European ones, the power production, so the inframarginal one. Then we saw the European gas price cap, and then we see country by country for varied periods, varied price levels, price caps being introduced. Some of them for households and small and medium enterprises, some of them for industrial consumers, certain types of industrial consumers, and so on. And that's what is very interesting here. We see forces going into different directions. On one hand, you have the European institutions working on this electricity market design on those gas packages, and on the other hand, you have member states trying to put themselves into better positions, or at least their industry in better positions, by introducing some of those price caps. I remember at the first introduction of this, somebody was joking to me and said, yeah, you probably won't have a job anymore because everybody would be, everything will be regulated. Well, maybe I was hoping to end up in an easier energy market. Unfortunately, it was not, and that's what you see here. Because everybody was running in a different direction. You as an energy buyer, in country A, you have a price cap for 70% of your volume. In country B, you have a price cap, but only for the next 2 months, and then it will be reviewed the quarter after, and you have to fill in another 12 documents. So that is the reality we see at this moment in time. And that's what I would describe as the axis of tension. So we come from a liberalization clearly happening on a European level into maybe a re-regulation. Some of the people here in the room that were involved into the Mexican market in the past could recognize that. I always see it, to bring it visually, I always see it as a pendulum, swinging from left to right. And we had that period of liberalization, pendulum on the left, and then maybe moving it more and more to the right. And we have that action of tension between the two, European having a certain agenda, certain member states having another agenda. On top of that, we see an increasing impact of certain governments, nationalist governments or populist governments. We have European elections that are coming up next year. So there are quite some tensions on that axis at this moment in time. And the main one, of course, was the energy crisis. That was the trigger for all of this. To conclude, two things that we see at very recently is pushback from European institutions. Namely, they are urging member states to say, please bring some more, reduce your debt and your deficits and adapt again to the reality of a more stricter financial regime. They let it go after COVID, and then they spend a lot of money after the energy crisis. And now they want to bring back to some more rigorous spending. Next to that was yesterday a publication of the European Commission where they themselves said some of the temporary measures that we took, maybe we should conclude those and have to put them to an end by the end of this year or the end of this winter. In that sense, I think we'll see quite some interesting times ahead with the elections coming up and some different interests between different parties.